Chapter 8 Titania's Exile. As Apollyon was running the auto-calibration software on his artificial body, Eudenthio was filling in as Titania's tutor due to Dr. Kitsune's medical-related absence. But before Eudenthio started with Dr. Kitsune's lesson plan, she made Titania some hot chocolate from scratch and baked some strawberry cupcakes with real strawberries inside them. Then Titania took a sip from the hot chocolate with some marshmallows and milk and put it down and asked Eudenthio, "So, what boring lecture did Dr. Kitsune have planned for me today?" Eudenthio then rolls her eyes in agreement while folding up the lesson plan and putting it away and says, "I wouldn't blame the old foxman for boring lectures when the royal censors aren't allowing him to teach to his full potential, especially Zulshuran history from the Zulshuran perspective. I've already read the lesson plan and materials, and if I'm being honest here, without knowing what the Zulshurans believe about themselves in comparison to what we have recorded about them, this history lesson is absolutely worthless. For as most of us nymphs and Amorians in Sylvania Grove very much dislike the elves, we've always made sure to understand their perspective and better reach agreements that have prevented needless wars multiple times throughout the past 500 years. Which, in all honesty, understand how other people see things as a far more useful life skill than memorizing a whole bunch of facts that don't mean anything in this day and age. But isn't it good for us royals to censor what people see so they won't be poisoned with false ideas, especially of those of the Zulshurans, Kakistani, and the Americans who reject our royal divine right to rule over them?" Eudenthio's heart then sinks as she fearfully says, "How do I answer this? I know you wouldn't tell your father about what I'm about to say, right? Can you promise me you won't tell your father about what I'm about to tell you?" Titania then confusedly promised, "I promise I won't tell him." Eudenthio then let out a heavy sigh of relief as she said, "At least you're someone I can trust to be honest with. Tell you the truth, I heavily disapprove of the way your education is being censored at your own detriment. I have read some of what they're teaching you, and it's just plain untrue about everyone who is not allied with your kingdom. I grew up in the Fey Kingdom, and have always been familiar with American culture from the tradesmen that would come across our border. And what they're telling you in these history books is not at all what I've seen. It's the same with Zulshura too. Although I have not been to the mainland of the Confederate Republic of Zulshura, I've been to parts of Zulshuran colonies bordering the Elven Kingdom, and they aren't the degenerates your censored textbooks say they are. In fact, a lot of them are actually good people just looking to start a better life for themselves in the outer colonies." Titania then turns red as she asks, "How come I was never told this before? Are you or my father keeping other secrets from me without me knowing?" "I can only speak for myself, but I've been doing my best to be completely honest with you. I will never knowingly lie to you unless it's for your own good, which it never is. Everything I've done for you as your father's appointed caregiver was for your best interest. You truly are a good person, Eudenthio. It's a real shame how many of the other nobles and members of the royal court treat you. It seems like the only people who are nice to you are Apollyon, Artemis, and Dr. Kitsune, whereas the dark necro-mage Isis is the meanest woman I have ever met, and especially towards you. But then again, why do you act like such a pushover?" Eudenthio then gags on her words as she says, "I'm just trying to be nice to people." "Maybe you're a little too nice. Try to be more like Artemis, who stands up for herself." I just don't want to seem rude. Is there something wrong with that?" "No, but I think you take it a little too far. Perhaps that is why Donderes, like you, get treated so badly." As Apollyon the gunslinger completed the calibration of his artificial body, he walked in on Eudenthio and Titania reclined on the couch, with an open Pepsi can in his hand and a loaded blast-plated revolver on his hip, and asked, "I heard you were going to tell Titania a little about Zulshuran history." Titania then said to Apollyon, "I believe we were, until we got sidetracked about other things." Apollyon then takes a swig from his Pepsi can and says, "I can sure tell you a lot of stuff I learned from Zulshuran movies and literature, but I doubt it will matter for what goes on in this kingdom. If this kingdom doesn't even respect the personal liberties of regular people, unless you're a member of a noble house, what will learning about the freest and most prosperous nation in the history of this planet even do for this kingdom?" Titania then looks at Apollyon with curiosity and suggests, "Maybe it should result in the betterment of this kingdom when I take my father's place." Apollyon then empties the 7 357 Magnum cartridges from the cylinder of his revolver, while twirling it, and says, "Well, if you're going to do that, the best way to learn about Zulshuran history is to go there. Maybe by understanding the way people behave in that culture, you understand the importance of its history and why it matters to them. You can sure learn a lot just by looking. But of course, your dad wouldn't allow that. Jonathan crossed her arms and taps her foot. And why not? Doesn't a princess like myself deserve to see the world? Not to a tyrant. He's probably afraid to become one of us and ruin his legacy. Johnny then puts her small hands on her hips and scrunches her face while saying, And why would I ruin the legacy of a good king on purpose? That's because there's two kinds of people in this world. Those that are good, and those who will stop at nothing to gain power at the expense of others. I've seen both. Now, you just guess which one your father is, and why these nobles haven't given up their power for a fair system of governments run by the people for the past 800 years. That's because my subjects are too uneducated to govern themselves, and need us nobles to rule over them. And if that's really the case, then how come us as all Sherwins were able to have a working republic for the past 300 years without a king or any nobility? If society really needs a monarchy, then why are the most successful countries always Christian republics like Zalshura, and the most horrendous are always authoritarian anti-Christian regimes? Then if you ever become the queen and accomplish many good things for your people, how are you going to guarantee future leaders of your kingdom will be as good as you when the very idea of an absolute monarchy has no checks and balances? I'll make sure no evil king replaces me as heir to the throne, and I will rule my kingdom with truth and justice. What if you're wrong? What then? Aren't you then not ruling your future kingdom with truth and consequently not being just? If you believe a lie to be true and act upon it, how can that action ever be justified? Tony then gets frustrated and angrily asks Apollyon, Why are you asking me such difficult questions? I'm only 16. Apollyon then inquires further, Well, you are the future queen of this kingdom, and these questions will be standard issue. So, I suggest you find an answer, because unless you recognize that even kings can be wrong, how do you minimize the effects of natural imperfection? Dentha then steps between Apollyon and Titania and sweetly asks, Apollyon, dear, would you please be a little gentler with Titania? She is still years off from inheriting her father's kingdom. Apollyon then bluntly says, For her own good, I can't be. She's going to have to face reality sooner or later, and it's better she be pissed off now and sting a little than be killed by it later in a Ceylonese communist revolution-style uprising. Dentha then taps Apollyon on the shoulder with her index finger and asks with a soft voice, Can you please just let Titania be a child for a few more years? She'll eventually grow out of it, and I have faith that she is able to come to terms with the real world and do great things on her own. Apollyon then feels bad about being blunt with Dentha and lowers his voice, saying, I know what you're trying to get at here, but I have no faith in royalty just like any other red-blooded Zalshuran. If Titania doesn't denounce royalty and correct her father's wrongdoing, I have little faith that her kingdom will survive for much longer. If it doesn't fall apart with corruption and a blow to bureaucracy, it'll most likely fall due to an uprising or a revolution like the one that destroyed the Third Lunar Empire. Titania then listened in on what Apollyon was saying and didn't understand because she never learned about the Third Lunar Empire, nor the true history between the Ceylonese and the Zalshurans. Titania then proceeded to be important, so she excused herself to her good friend Artemis and her quarters and asked, Do you have a moment? Artemis then finished putting her silky black hair into a dark braid and replied, Of course I have time for you, although I'm about to catch on a plane with Dentha in a few hours to return to my queendom for some time. But spending some time with you might make my life a little less messy before I get scolded by my mother for spending a few days in Zalshura and whatnot. I'm surprised you mentioned that, because I was about to ask you something about Zalshura and your queendom. I overheard Apollyon and Dentha talk about my education that I might not be being told the whole story, especially when it comes to your queendom and at those best misguided Zalshurans. And since you're from the Lunar Queendom where all this happened, I'd like to ask you what really happened between your queendom and Zalshura, if you don't mind me asking. Of course I don't mind. However, the history between my queendom and Zalshura goes back almost 2,800 years, and it's quite a complicated relationship. So I guess the better question would be what era you want to know about. Is it the primordial times, prehistoric times, the First Lunar Empire, or is it something more recent, like the War to End All Wars, the Cold War, and the Age of Restoration? What about the Third Lunar Empire I heard Apollyon talking about? Artemis's face then sulks in embarrassment for the history of her queendom and says, "Then perhaps Apollyon has a morbid obsession with the worst queen my queendom ever had. If it wasn't for Empress Diana the Terrible, perhaps my queendom wouldn't be associated with the atrocities she committed. If it weren't for Diana's arrogance, the war to end all wars might have never happened. The communists wouldn't have established the Union of Lunar Communist Republics, and my queendom would probably never have had to ever be the target of Zalshura's policy of unequally assured destruction for the past 140 years. But if you're really interested in what really happened during the final years of the Third Lunar Empire, there are plenty of documentaries about it, although 90% of them are in Zalshuran, and the other 10% are the 90%, dubbed in Selenese. And that doesn't really surprise me, since the whole reason the Zalshuran occupation after the war was to completely destroy everything Selenese about my queendom and replace it with everything Zalshuran. Titania then says in a ranting tone, "What a bunch of assholes those Zalshurans were, and if as far as I can see it, from what you told me, they really are full of themselves, aren't they? They sound and act like they're better than everyone else and intolerant to people who are different from them. So shame on them and their society. When my kingdom conquers other kingdoms, we always allow them to keep their way so long as they conform to my father's will that is above them. In fact, it is exactly because of Zalshura that the Age of Restoration in my queendom took so long. During the Cold War with the Zalshurans, millions of innocent people starved to death because the Selenese communist regime that only existed due to Zalshura generating a massive power vacuum in my queendom. After the atomic bombing of Lunsaro on May 11th, 1957, millions of innocent people were vaporized in seconds, killing Empress Diana and most of the Lunar Queendom hierarchs. Whoever survived the initial blast was forced to live through the hell of nuclear fallout, with their skin melting while they were still alive in the black rain that poisoned them with radiation. It was not only a betrayal of the ceasefire agreement we had with the Zalshurans, but for the Vertok religious festival of rebirth. But they chose the holiest day out of the Vertok year to drop the atomic bomb when they knew the city would be most populated. It was nothing short of the Fourth Crusade, but instead of sparing my people like they did in previous crusades, they chose to annihilate everything we held dear. Then we lived in a dark age, not knowing if we'd ever see the moon again rise again, till the goddess Luna herself sent the United States to save us from our Zalshuran overlords. But now that the United States is an ally of my queendom and supported us in our efforts against the Zalshurans, their presence in the southern region has made Zalshura's dark hegemony completely vanish within my queendom. Titania then looks at Artemis with confusion and asks, "Why would a nation that actively commits genocide on neighboring kingdoms and loots from the poor and gives to the rich ever help a queendom like yours? It makes no sense." Artemis then shrugs and replies, "Well, it's complicated. We're quite different in how we do things, although we have some things in common. My mother, Queen Paxara, has been spending a lot of time lately making peace with the Americans, while her commander-in-chief, Umbriel Skigore, has been modernizing our defensive capability to the point where Zalshura isn't a threat anymore. Now the most Zalshura could do, since we have American help, is make empty threats and think angry thoughts about my queendom. Zalshura can now try launching as many missiles as they want, since none of them are going to hit their target, let alone get within 10 miles of the southern border. Now gone are the days of unequally assured destruction, with wars against Shurans in the coming decades seeming very unlikely. So really, despite their flaws, the Americans are actually the good guys towards my queendom. But apart from political matters, I have something more important to ask you. And what might that be? My question is, why have you not been taught this very important history when your kingdom is so closely related to mine? Why are you being educated in such a way that is basically pushing a narrative rather than having you figure things out for yourself? I mean, have you ever thought to ask what you ever wanted out of your life, rather than some king demanding you live a certain way because it's his will? I know Dr. Kitsune is not a bad teacher. In fact, he's a very intelligent foxman, but for some reason, he's not himself when he has to educate you." Titania then contemplates Artemis's question as a flurry of emotions rose inside her. She felt rage and indignation as she felt lied to by her father and scowled her face and says to Artemis, "I'd love to talk further, but I have to go see my father. I have a bone to pick with him, and it turns out I've been lied to during my education this whole time. By lying to me, my father has endangered the future of my kingdom, and I cannot allow that. This is not right. Artemis then curtsies and says to her, Well, I wish you the best of luck. Hopefully whatever's going on between you and your father gets resolved. Titania then marches into King Azrael's throne room and starts demanding answers. Titania starts by asking, with her small arms crossed and foot tapping, Question, why are you keeping secrets from me? To which King Azrael responds, What secrets dost thou speaketh? Accuseth thou me of a lying tongue? Titania then stamps her foot on the ground. As a matter of fact, I am. I trusted you would raise me in a matter that was right and just, but now I see you've made Dr. Kitsune lie to me for your own gain. How dare you treat me, your own daughter, as a disposable commoner who doesn't deserve to know the truth when I am a princess? Azrael then stood up from his throne, holding a golden scepter, and asks, Who told you such slander against me? As his fingertips glow purple with magical energy. Titania then summons a magic spear with a fairy magic and points at her father, saying, Identhio told me the truth, and she would never lie to me. And if she wasn't enough, that nobility-hating but of good conscience, Apollyon, spoke to me of your refusal to allow Dr. Kitsune to teach me the truth of his own people. Why? Why must you keep me from knowing the truth about this world? Azrael then gives Titania the stare of death as he says in a condemning tone, If you knew of Zolshur's true nature, you would see how much of an enemy they really are to my kingdom, and the very fact that you have asked about their true nature is evidence against your noble blood. If you wish to join the Zolshurans, your royal blood will mean nothing to us, the true lords of men, and you will become our enemy. So, what will it be? Eternal condemnation for opposing our divine right by siding with the Zolshurans, or beg for mercy and live at my grace? This is what this kingdom is truly about. In ruling with an iron fist, I'd rather die than inherit the throne. And die you will, as an enemy of the gods and a friend of Zolshura. King Azrael then unleashes a painful magical-based flame on Titania and siphons the energy from her body as she collapses unconscious on the marble floor. King Azrael then summons his general Amelia and orders him, Have your men move Titania to the planet Draksus, to either the Zolshuran or American hemisphere. She has learned too much. But I will not shed noble blood as that of a peasant, but rather that she be killed by the enemy she now finds herself making comfort. If the Americans shall kill her, let it be an example to our friends in Luna Quintum of their poor decision to make friends with our enemy. If she be killed by Zolshurans, let it be reminded to the noble houses of what happens when they turn against their king. Now I have an important matter to attend to with that scoundrel Apollyon and that fair maiden Identhio. Amelia then summons 2 soldiers in his native language to carry Titania's unconscious body to a starship and dump her in the middle of a desert on the Zolshuran side of the planet Draksus. There, she will be left to suffer extreme heat and dehydration, and die unless someone finds her and she lives.